Hello, everyone. Christophe Porot here, host of the pop culture and philosophy series that you are watching. In this episode, we are going to be taking a close look at what it means to be liberated if you're a Pokemon. Such a case was made by Team Plasma when they said all Pokemons must be set free. And it's worth exploring. What did they mean? In which way are Pokemon unfree? In which way could they be free? And a host of other great questions, all to be explored in this chapter, written by myself and my co author, Alan Simon, for Carus Books. Enjoy! Team Plasma was right. Sort of. By Christophe Porot and Alan Simon. Published by Carus Books. Introduction. What's going on with Pokemon? When the Pokemon TV and video game series first came onto the scene in the late 1990s, there was little question as to who the bad guys were in the universe. Team Rocket, the villainous organization whose objectives were to steal Pokemon and take over the world. It was easy to feel empowered as a kid by identifying with Ash and Red, the child protagonists of the show and video game, respectively, who could single-handedly take down the adult criminals. Classic story of good versus evil. Then, over a decade later, our blissful childhood innocence was stripped away by Team Plasma, the enemy organization in the black and white generation of the TV game series, who forces us to confront the harsh reality that the good guys in the Pokemon universe might not be so different from the likes of Team Rocket. Sure, Team Rocket might have gone a step further by stealing Pokemon from their trainers, but these trainers, including those of us playing the video games, were capturing innocent wild Pokemon in tiny Pokeballs and forcing them to fight against each other in battle. Were the good guys we identified with for so long really all that morally superior to the bad guys like Team Rocket? How could the good guys be wrong? Toward the beginning of the Pokemon Black and White video game, we are first introduced to Team Plasma through a particularly memorable scene in which Getsis, the leader of Team Plasma, delivers an eloquent speech in the middle of a public square. If you had played any of the earlier games in the franchise, this is the point at which you'd expect to hear some phony, unconvincing justification for why this particular iteration of villains thinks they have the right to steal and commit other crimes and rule over the rest of us. Nobody buys their arguments, of course, and for the rest of the game you get to be the hero by beating up on the cowardly criminals that nobody likes without a second thought. But that's not what happens here. Instead, Getsis makes some really compelling points about the problematic nature of our relationships with Pokemon that we had never previously been asked to question. Quote, Pokemon are subject to the selfish commands of their trainers, he says. Quote, they get pushed around when they are partners at work, end quote. He concludes with a simple plea to his audience. If you truly care about your Pokemon, the only rational and compassionate option is to release them back into the wild at once. He doesn't try to steal anything. He doesn't try to fight anyone. He just takes his minions with him and walks off, leaving behind a crowd of stunned video game townsfolk asking themselves the same question we must ourselves consider. Have we been the villains all along, holding living creatures against their will while forcing them to inflict and endure acts of violence and pain? More broadly speaking, the philosophical question we are asked to wrestle with is this. If one is dominated by or subordinate to another, can one be free? The answer to this question is not as immediately obvious as it might seem. Some philosophers have argued that a relationship of dominance, like slavery or dictatorships, undermines freedom no matter what. This is known as the Republican view of freedom, which, to be clear, is not the same as the Republican Party in the United States, even if there is a historical connection. Others have argued that what truly matters is how free one is to move about at their own discretion, independent of the structure of the relationship itself. So, are the Pokemon that we've cared for as cherished companions for so long free in a philosophical sense? And should our attitudes, intentions, and treatment of them be considered as relevant factors in answering this question? To explore how these opposing viewpoints play out in the Pokemon world, we need to take a look at the challenge Team Plasma poses to the rest of the Pokeverse. What is freedom? This problem can be understood by first identifying the dominant relationship trainers have over their Pokemon. According to the Republican theory of freedom, championed by the philosopher Philip Pettit, one cannot be free so long as one is dominated by another. If you are subject to the arbitrary will of another being, you are not free. Simple as that. If, for instance, you are a slave, then you are not free. This is true even if you have the most benevolent slave master in the world who lets you do as you wish. Even if you are a Pokemon controlled by Ash, who in turn treats you as a friend and provides you with all of your wants and needs, you would still be a slave, even if you truly enjoyed traveling and battling with him. According to the Republican account of freedom, freedom is determined by the structure of the relationship you hold with others and not by the content of what you can or can't do with your life. There are three conditions to being dominated. First, someone has the capacity to interfere with another. Second, they can interfere on an arbitrary basis. Third, they can interfere in certain choices that the other is in a position to make. So the question naturally arises as to whether Pokemon can be said to be dominated in this way. Are the choices the Pokemon are in a position to make? Are there choices the Pokemon are in a position to make? Can the master interfere on an arbitrary basis, making decisions without regard to the interest of the Pokemon? Can Pokemon be free? On the surface, it certainly seems Pokemon are being dominated. As Team Plasma suggests, we call them friends but treat them like slaves. They can be forced into a Pokeball at any time. They can be traded between trainers and even sold for money, as we see in episode 15 of Pokemon Indigo League, Battle Aboard the St. Anne. But what about the fact that Pikachu, unlike other Pokemon, walks freely as he wishes rather than being forced to stay inside a Pokeball? What about episode 36, Pikachu's Goodbye, when Ash leaves Pikachu to be with his own kind in the wild, and Pikachu willingly chooses to stay with Ash? Or the fan favorite episode 12, Here Comes the Squirtle Squad, when a rogue of Squirtle voluntarily becomes Ash's Pokemon after being moved by Ash's effort. When a rogue Squirtle voluntarily becomes Ash's Pokemon after being moved by Ash's effort to protect him and his friends from Team Rocket. Is there some sense in which the Pokemon voluntarily commit themselves to this asymmetrical friendship? Does the benevolence of the master mean the slave is free despite being a slave? How can so many beings exist essentially as slaves without presenting an ethical problem? The justification which appears to be used in the Pokemon world to make sense of this relies on a theory of liberty known as negative liberty. What is negative liberty? Negative liberty is understood as freedom from barriers, obstacles, constraints, and other elements that interfere with our free movement, actions, and choices. In a sense, for the negative liberty theorist, it does not matter what we are doing or why we are doing it. The only feature which explains whether we are free or unfree is the presence or lack thereof of external constraints against our movement. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on negative and positive liberty gives the example of a cigarette smoker driving to get to a gas station where she could acquire cigarettes. From a positive liberty perspective, her addiction possibly undermines her freedom by enslaving her from within. But for the negative liberty theorist, all that matters is that she is not being prevented from going where she wants to go, independent of why she wants to get there. In the case of the Pokemon TV series, support for negative liberty is frequently illustrated through the willingness demonstrated by captive Pokemon to train and get stronger so that they can win more battles. It's as though they are choosing to be where they are, fighting as they wish, with their masters merely helping them do what they've freely chosen to do. Negative liberty says our highest ambitions and ideals do not define our freedom. Simply put, the lack of external impositions against us allows us to be free. So it doesn't matter if the Pokemon could actualize a higher potential living in the world. They are choosing to train and fight, and they are doing so in each episode and every scene. There's no obvious barrier or constraint on them. What constitutes a barrier or constraint is usually external rather than internal. If the law opposes a certain action, it is the threat of force or coercion backing up the law that limits your freedom. Questions about the legitimacy of the law or your emotional response to it are irrelevant for purposes of determining the extent of your freedom. The intellectual historian who coined the term negative liberty, Isaiah Berlin, expresses this perspective as follows. Quote, "If I am prevented by others from doing what I could otherwise do, I am to that degree unfree. And if this area is contracted by other men beyond a certain minimum, I can be described as being coerced, or it may be enslaved." End quote. If you are either coerced or enslaved because of others, then you are unfree in a political sense. What's the difference? An immediate clash arises between negative and Republican theories of freedom. Under negative liberty, you are free so long as no one is constraining your free movement. But under Republicanism, you are unfree even if you can move freely within a relationship of dominance. So what about Ash's treatment of Pikachu, whom he describes in Season 16, Episode 13, The Name's N, as, quote, "my number one friend and partner"? Judging by their relationship, Ash is a benevolent master. But according to Team Plasma, the full potential of Pokemon cannot be known or reached so long as they remain unfree. Thus, in the video game, Team Plasma's mission statement is to, quote, "separate Pokemon from people so Pokemon can regain their original power," end quote. How could a benevolent master prevent you from reaching your full potential? Well, Republican theorists of liberty have many case examples of that. Patet argues that the dependence relationship changes someone for the worse, even when they succeed in finding a way to limit interference. In Republicanism, a theory of freedom in government, he analyzes a point about the consequences of dominant relationships in a gendered context made by the famous 18th century women's rights advocate Mary Wollstonecraft, who writes that, quote, "it is vain to expect virtue from a woman till they are, in some degree, independent of man," end quote. Mary Wollstonecraft argued that the accusation against women that they are manipulative, or, more specifically, cunning, was unfair because their dependence on men made it necessary for them to deploy cunning behavior in order to achieve their goals. If you call someone weak and powerless, you can't really blame them when they use that perception of them as weak and powerless to their advantage. In the case of Pokemon, we can't say for sure whether they are truly love battling or if they are doing so simply out of necessity to thrive within the constraints of their dependence on trainers. Crucially for Republicanism, whether it is a woman dominated by a man or a slave by a master, the very condition of dependence might change who they are even when they are not interfered with. Therefore, according to Republicanism, the very condition of being dominated can make you slave-like, and consequently must be prevented from arising, both in relationships between private individuals and in the case of a state towards its citizens. Consequently, an essential element for freedom is ensuring that arbitrary interference is impossible. In the Pokemon case, it seems trainers are entitled to arbitrary interference. They're able to interfere in the choices that Pokemon would otherwise be able to make. It is therefore conceivable that Team Plasma has a point. So long as Pokemon are property, they may not be able to transform themselves into the type of beings they are capable of becoming. Perhaps the earliest and most memorable voicing of this concern in the history of Pokemon comes in the form of Mewtwo, the legendary Pokemon who is the main subject of Pokemon, the first movie. Mewtwo is an ultra-powerful Pokemon created in a lab at the direction of Team Rocket leader Giovanni, who seeks to exploit Mewtwo's powers for his own goals of world domination. Mewtwo catches on quickly, abandoning Giovanni to become the master of his own destiny and to search for answers about the meaning and purpose of life for Pokemon, beyond their subservience to human trainers. Particularly, he is obsessed with questions about his own purpose, as he reflects upon the exploitative nature of his origin. Is that my purpose? Am I just an experiment? End quote. Clearly, this is an unacceptable answer, and he is determined to find out for himself what his true capabilities are. But they are not humans, right? The issue of Pokemon potential brings up a further question about Team Plasma's case. Pokemon are non-human beings, so why should we care about their freedom? It might be tempting to say this consideration brings us into the territory of animal rights, but Pokemon seem to express some capacities which are known to be human and which belong to very few animals, if any. For one, Pokemon are incredibly intelligent. Mewtwo, after all, communicates telepathically with humans and Pokemon alike and is even able to control the minds of both. Another obvious example of this is Meowth, the Pokemon companion and partner of Team Rocket, Grunts Jesse and James, who walks and speaks just like a human and participates in concocting and executing various schemes for stealing Pokemon, especially Ash's Pikachu. And even though Meowth is unique in his ability to communicate through human speech, it is clear that other Pokemon communicate through a language of their own. Proof of this includes the way members of the Squirtle Squad communicate with one another and orchestrate elaborate pranks on townspeople. Ash is also frequently seen as conversing with his own Pokemon, especially Pikachu, in a way that demonstrates mutual understanding. All of this amounts to Pokemon being, as Team Plasma said, beings of unknown potential. Finally, there is a famous thought experiment designed to demonstrate the legitimacy of animal rights. The case goes as follows. Suppose an alien species came to Earth that was dramatically more intelligent and powerful than us. Compared to them, we are basically animals. Now suppose they want to use us as instruments to their own ends, to harvest humans or whatever else they have in mind, but they give us an out. If we can demonstrate to them that we don't treat non-human species as instruments, then they won't treat us that way either. Designed to make us think about animal rights, this thought experiment, or something like it, plays out in Pokemon the first movie. Mewtwo was told his only purpose was to serve his master, and he decided to flip the script and become, quote, the master of humans and Pokemon alike, end quote. As with the hypothetical alien visitors of our philosophical thought experiment, Mewtwo justifies his attempted domination of humanity as simply being equivalent to humanity's treatment of Pokemon. Quote, you are a dangerous species, he says to a group of human trainers. You brought me into this world with no purpose but to be your slave. In the end, Mewtwo is ultimately persuaded not to become a master for a simple reason: love and relationships. He realizes the depth of meaning to be found within strong relationships when he sees Ash sacrifice himself in a vain effort to end the violence between Pokemon he had been orchestrating through his telepathic powers. Furthermore, he is moved by the subsequent emotional and memorable scene in which Ash is resurrected by the tears of the surrounding Pokemon who are collectively grieving his sacrifice, led, of course, by Pikachu. Quote, it wasn't until they put aside their differences, Mewtwo reflects, that I realized the true power they had inside, end quote. Reflecting on his own existential quest for meaning in life, he goes on to say, quote, I see now the circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. It is what you do with the gift of life that determines who you are. He flees the scene, mysteriously telling Ash he's off to, quote, a place where I can learn what you know so well, end quote. What relationship would be best for Pokemon? Maybe this unravels the issue at stake. It is not necessarily that Pokemon deserve the political condition of freedom as a right, but rather that in a Pokemon world, masters and Pokemon stand in a peculiar relationship to each other and need to enable each other to be free. Such a case is made in the book Zoopolis by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlecka, which argues that our relationship to the non-human world should be understood in relational rather than political rights language. In other words, the obligations we owe to non-human beings go beyond the simplistic approach of complete separation from them that Team Plasma seeks. So what would this mean for the case about Pokemon freedom? It would mean that perhaps neither republicanism nor negative liberty perfectly explain how to maximize freedom in the Pokemon world. Taking a relational approach, we can look at a theory of non-sovereign freedom sourced in Hannah Arendt and Frederick Douglass by the scholar Sharon Krauss. In this view, freedom is a twofold relationship between your individual volitions and the receptiveness of those volitions through the social and political net you are embedded in. The essential point is that even individual freedom, which requires individual action, reflects a collective success. Even if you have wishes and dreams and desires, They may not constitute volitions if they can't be translated into real action within the social landscape you inhabit. In other words, there are two parts to your freedom: your individual action and the social uptake to that action. Simply put, other individuals are intertwined in your ability to be free. One example of this comes in through the Squirtle Squad episode. As mentioned earlier, a gang of rogue Squirtles run around terrorizing the neighboring townspeople. The local police officer, Jenny, explains that these Squirtles are acting out because, similar to Mewtwo, they were betrayed or abandoned by their human trainers. She adds that, quote, if only they had trainers to care about them, they wouldn't be as sad, end quote. By the end of the episode, of course, the leader of the gang chooses Ash to be his new trainer. But what happens to the rest of them? They are given jobs working alongside human firefighters due to their ability to launch. Fast forwarding back to the black and white games and TV episodes, the character N, who had been groomed to be the future leader of Team Plasma as Ghetsis' successor, becomes the focal point of an ideological debate over the different theories of freedom we have discussed. Though he decides to fight against Team Plasma upon realizing their selfish and power-hungry ulterior motives, N still maintains the view that Pokemon can never be free to actualize their potential so long as they are controlled by people. Like Mewtwo, he is also obsessed with discovering the true purpose of life for Pokemon and sees Pokemon ownership as a huge impediment to this. He explains this to Ash in Season 16, Episode 17, Saving Braviria. Quote, I've been thinking long and hard about why Pokemon exist in our world and how their presence affects us. So now I've finally come to a conclusion. A Pokemon's purpose has nothing to do with harming people or destroying anything. It's simply impossible. Pokemon battles, Pokemon being forced to fight, that's why I can't stand them, end quote. N therefore begins by subscribing to a Republican theory of freedom, even though he sees Ash as a rare instance of a truly benevolent trainer. N remains very inflexible in his thinking for most of the black and white story in both the TV series and the games. He is committed to a particular vision of reality, more specifically, for our purposes, a particular vision of freedom. In The Name's N, he muses, I've had questions for a long time. Why are there Pokemon in our world? Why do they exist? Why is our world the way it is? Do we know if Pokemon are really happy? There are many conflicting ways of seeing things that seem to be gray areas. I can't accept that. I need to know that Pokemon's lives have meaning, end quote. Similarly, in the games, he remarks, many different values mix together, and the world becomes gray. That is unforgivable. I will separate Pokemon and people, and black and white will be clearly distinct. The title Black and White perhaps demonstrates an awareness on the part of the Pokemon writers that the simplistic black and white treatment of morality in Pokemon, trainers like Ash are good, Team Rocket is evil, was no longer adequate for an audience of aging Poke fans on the cusp of adulthood. What comes after black and white thinking? The narrative of N's relationship with Ash, or alternatively, the player-controlled protagonist of the games, ends in a way similar to that of Mewtwo in the Pokemon movie. N is eventually so moved by the powerful bonds he witnesses between Ash and his Pokemon that he confesses to the limitations of his own black and white thinking and admits he still has much to learn about humanity. Pokemon, their relationships with one another, and the meaning and purpose of life for both. As he explains to Ash in Season 16, Episode 23, Ash and N, a clash of ideals. Quote, I've been chasing after Team Plasma for such a long time, and I've witnessed all kinds of relationships between people and Pokemon, end quote. The significance of this reflection can be further drawn out via a passage from Zoopolis. Different relationships generate different duties. Our relations with animals are likely to have a similar sort of moral complexity given the enormous variation in our historic relationships with different categories of animals. End quote. The strength of this relational view is that it allows us to recognize that the conditions for freedom in the Pokemon universe may not have a one-size-fits-all answer. For Mewtwo, fulfilling his potential meant breaking ties with an exploitative master and eventually retreating from human and Pokemon society. For the Squirtle Squad, freedom meant being given a new purpose within society to fill the void left by being abandoned by their former trainers. For Ash and Pikachu, whose strong bond has been forged over a long series of trials and adventures, satisfying their goals means sticking together and supporting one another. And for Ash's other Pokemon, freedom means being part of a team that with a shared goal and a confident leader. As Zen remarks in Season 16, Episode 24, Team Plasma and the Awakening Ceremony, quote, that strong bond isn't just between Ash and his Pokemon. When Ash is involved, an amazing bond forms between the Pokemon themselves, end quote. Whether you believe Pokemon lack freedom or not will depend crucially on how sensitive you are to relationships of dominance as such. It really boils down to whether Ash's Pokemon in particular are free, since he is the ideal benevolent master that would permit his Pokemon to exercise their negative liberty. It is through this exercise of negative liberty that we encounter the first defense of liberty in the Pokemon world. However, as we've suggested, perhaps a non-sovereign theory of freedom makes even more sense when trying to account for how Pokemon and humans alike can be free. Perhaps the blend of individual initiative and social uptake explain freedom in a way that accords with the Pokemon world because everyone is embedded in a set of relationships that permits or constrains their individual wishes. Nonetheless, Team Plasma is right from a Republican perspective, which seems to be a theoretical framework they deploy to account for the unfreedom of Pokemon. So what do you think? Should there be a revolution that frees the Pokemon? Should there be improved social conditions to free both Pokemon and humans alike? Or should we just say that despite the structure of the relationships we hold to one another, Pokemon and humans are free so long as they are not actively constrained against their will? Hello, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that roller coaster ride of ideas. And if that's the kind of thing that entertains you, please consider checking out more YouTube videos made by me, Christophe Porot, or subscribing to this channel so that future pop culture and philosophy videos come to your feed. Down the pipe, we've got Anthony Bourdain in philosophy, Homeland in philosophy, Mr. Robot in philosophy, and a host of other really exciting TV shows, films, and musical characters as they relate to philosophical ideas. Stay tuned.